They built a rocket that could climb to the heavens in minutes, and still more German pilots died trying to fly it than Allied bombers they ever reached. Germany's rocket interceptors were the last wild gamble of a collapsing air force, machines born of brilliant minds, forged with terrifying chemistry, flown by men squeezed between duty and doom. This is the story of speed wired to desperation, of the Me-163 Komet and the Bochum Ba-349 Natter, of blazing thrust, shattered nerves, and the bitter lesson that ingenuity alone cannot win a war. The war in the skies had changed. By 1943 and into 1944, Allied air power had moved from sporadic raids to coordinated mass streams. Thousands of four-engine bombers, heavy, gray, and iron-hearted, slipped into the night in columns so dense they looked like rolling thunder on radar. German fighters fought to climb, to catch, to break into those streams. They tried. Too often, they were too late. German engineers answered with a radical idea. Don't chase, launch. Rapid, upward, and strike. Use rockets for raw, instant acceleration. Build point defense interceptors that could climb past the bomber formations in minutes, fire devastating salvos, then glide back to Earth. Make an aircraft that dwarfed speed as its weapon. The first shape of that idea carried the name Komet. Alexander Lippisch, a brilliant aerodynamicist who had sketched delta wings and weird tailless forms long before the war, pushed a small, needle-nosed aircraft concept into production. The Messerschmitt Me-163 Komet was unlike anything in the sky. Short, stubby wings, a compact fuselage, and a rocket engine that spat liquid fire. Where conventional fighters relied on piston engines or turbojets, the Komet had raw chemical energy, violent, instant, and nearly uncontrollable. It climbed like an animal unleashed, from rest to battle altitude in a matter of minutes. It could reach the bomber stream when other fighters were still coughing up the climb. On paper, the math made a cold sort of sense. Speed plus altitude equals interception. But paper does not smell of burning fuel, and paper does not have a pilot's pulse. The Me-163's fuel system was a duet of poison. Two chemicals, T-Stoff and C-Stoff, lived in separate tanks until they met in the combustion chamber. They were hypergolic. They ignited spontaneously on contact. T-Stoff was concentrated hydrogen peroxide, corrosive and violent. C-Stoff, a hydrazine mixture, volatile and toxic. Together, they burned with appalling intensity. For mechanics and pilots, this meant constant danger. A leak could burn through clamps and skin. A spill could vaporize a man's uniform in seconds. There were stories, whispered and then written down, of ground crews carrying puddles of fuel away with rags that dissolved the cloth and the flesh beneath it.
The Komet's engine ran for only a few frantic minutes. That was by design. The rocket motor provided the climb and the attack burst, then it was done. What followed was always the same, a glider-like descent. The M-163 had minimal landing gear, a jettisonable trolley used during takeoff, and a skid for landing. It was made to be light, to trade anything non-essential for climb performance. But after an attack pass, the plane transformed from fiery spear into a slow, vulnerable target. Allied escort fighters learned to wait above the bomber stream and pick off the Komet as it fell. Several Komets were shot down in that helpless gliding state. Many more never made it off the ground. Inside the cockpit, the pilot's world was a narrow tunnel of dials, throttles, and a small plexiglass canopy smeared with condensation and fear. Imagine being strapped into a machine you know will scream like a Komet for a few minutes and then abandon you to glide home. Imagine a flight where every second of thrust is an all-in wager. Climb fast, aim true, fire rockets, and pray your descent doesn't meet a Spitfire or P-51. The human stories are the hardest to read. Test pilots and volunteers, some of them veterans of earlier, more conventional fights, carried the weight of experiments that had become weapons. They rode the Komet's raw power and discovered the aircraft's many ways to betray them. Fuel feed lines could detach under acceleration. Valves could stick. The hypergolic mix would, if the seals failed, eat through cockpit bulkheads. Landings that were routine for a He-111 could become instant conflagrations for a Komet pilot because a ruptured tank plus wood-packed skid plus friction equals explosion. Mechanics called it the flying crematorium. Pilots called it simply dangerous. If the Me-163 was a daring edge of innovation, the Basham BA-349 Natter was another kind of desperation altogether. Where the Komet carried the pilot into the sky and back, the Natter was closer to a vertically launched piloted missile. Designed by Eric Basham, the Natter was a point defense answer to the same problem: speed the intercept, fire, and jettison. It would launch vertically from a rail, powered by a solid rocket booster, climb at extreme acceleration into the bomber stream, release its armament of unguided rockets, and then the pilot would bail out or be recovered. The airframe was meant to be expendable. The Natter's logic was stark: simplify production, use basic materials, get a machine into the sky that cheap crews could operate, and saturate bomber corridors with one-way attacks. But simplifying production did not simplify the human cost. On 1 March 1945, a young test pilot, Lothar Schieber, climbed into a Natter for the first manned vertical launch. The launch was ambitious. It fired, the machine lifted, and then, in minutes, disaster. The canopy tore free, Schieber's seat lost orientation, and the rocket vehicle spiraled out of control. He was killed. The footage, crude and alarming, showed a machine promising speed and inevitability collapsing into itself. The Natter program never recovered from that test's human toll or its technical failures. It stood as another symbol of last-minute improvisation. You can imagine how these projects looked from a bomber crew's perspective. For the men aboard the heavy aircraft, the gunners on their tunnels, the pilots who wrestled massive, heavy birds through flak and cloud, the Komet and Natter were rumors at first, then curiosity, then irritation, then a nightmare. Bomber gunners reported glimpses of small, furious shapes streaking up out of the darkness. For crews who faced night after night of flak and fighters, the idea of a tiny rocket fighter climbing like a spear could be terrifying. But terror does not equal lethality. In combat, the Komet's kills were few, and their presence more psychological than destructive. Allied crews learned that a rocket climb might produce a flash of danger, and then, more often than not, an aircraft that fell back into the sky like a wounded bird.
The overall record is blunt. The Komets and Natters did not save cities. They did not change the war. Their successes, where they occurred, were tactical and limited. Their failures were catastrophic and often internal. The Luftwaffe, by 1944 and 1945, was a force stretched thin by fuel shortages, by lost production lines, by Allied bombing that devastated factories and supply chains. Engineers were under relentless pressure to deliver solutions that could be produced quickly, with materials that were not easy to steal from the rubble of shattered industry. Part of the tragedy is that the technical brilliance existed. German scientists and engineers were among the best in the world. The aerodynamic innovations embedded in the Me-163 were real. Lippisch and his team had produced a design that performed in a way no conventional aircraft of the era could match. The fine details of compressibility, of re-entry aerodynamics in a gliding descent, of rocket motor feed design, these were serious engineering achievements. But achievement on the bench differs from survivable application in the field. The Komets were prototypes pushed into production under stress. The Natters were concept cars for a war the creators already felt they were losing. Back on the line, pilots were often volunteers, but not always. Many were airmen who had proven themselves in earlier stages of the war, but were now recruited for the new weapons. They understood what they were signing up for: a higher risk, a chance to strike a blow, a beam of speed and hope that could not replace fuel trucks or factories. Some flew for status, some for patriotism, some out of a sense of duty and fatalism. The training was short, the machines were different. The losses were, frequently, the kind that did not return to base with an intact record of combat. One widely quoted, stark fact of these programs is the math of casualty versus effect. The Komets flew relatively few offensive sorties and claimed only a handful of bomber kills compared to the scale of Allied air operations. Meanwhile, accidents and operational failures killed many pilots. Those losses were not merely numbers on a graph, they were fathers, sons, trained pilots whose experience could not be replaced overnight. The Luftwaffe lost more than steel that winter of 1944-45. It lost a margin of human skill and institutional memory. There were also psychological failures inside the German high command that made these projects worse. Hitler's micromanagement, late-war doctrinal confusion, and the chaotic demands for Wunderwaffe, miracle weapons, created an environment where projects were pushed to the front before they were ready. The Me-262, the first operational jet fighter, suffered from delays and misuse because of these strategic missteps. The rocket interceptors, rushed into the field as stopgap measures, suffered from the same fate on a smaller, crueler scale.
The stories of accident and misuse are horrifying in small details. Maintenance crews spent hours in the dark, in bombed airfields, handling volatile liquids with rationed rubber gloves and minimal safety equipment. Trucks and cranes were scarce. The toll on ground crews was high. Burns, chemical exposures, long-term damage. The Komet's rocket exhaust could char runways and scorch the grass around the launching points. Simple logistics, where to store explosive propellants, how to containerize the chemicals safely, became serious operational headaches that the Luftwaffe had to solve while under air attack themselves. Contrast this with the Allied approach. The bomber stream's defense relied on overwhelming production, escort fighters with growing range and skill, and a logistics network that, by late 1944, had become devastatingly effective. The Allies could absorb losses and still fly thousands of sorties. Germany could not. So their solutions became surgical and exotic out of practical necessity. Rocket interceptors required fewer strategic materials for some components and promised higher immediate performance. But they also required highly trained pilots, precise maintenance, and secure supply lines for exotic fuels. The mismatch of resource cost versus operational need is a recurring theme in the final years of the Reich. And still, amid those failures, human courage cannot be ignored. Pilots climbing in Komets and Natters often did so with a clear eye to personal risk. Some became legends, others became anonymous names on casualty lists. There are accounts, reported by survivors, preserved in post-war memoirs, of pilots returning from a Komet sortie with soot on their faces, trembling but alive. aware that they had flown something both magnificent and malevolent. One can hear in those accounts a mixture of exhilaration and dread, the pure physics of acceleration married with the personal calculus of survival. Technically, the Me-163 would influence post-war thinking about high-speed aerodynamics. Engineers in the victorious powers studied captured airframes, test reports, and flight logs. The concept of rocket propulsion for intercept and the challenges it posed, fuel handling, short burn times, thermal stresses, informed designs for decades to come. But the moral of the story is not in blueprints. It is in the cost of applying raw innovation to a war where infrastructure fails and human lives are the expendable variable. The BA-349 Natter's legacy is perhaps the cruelest. It embodied a philosophy that treated aircraft as largely disposable, build cheaply, launch rapidly, accept losses. That approach undercut the value of experienced pilots and the doctrine that had supported aerial dominance for decades. Lothar Sieber's fatal test is often remembered not just for the tragedy of one man, but for what it revealed about how far the Reich had fallen into brinkmanship. The Natter's one-manned launch became a grotesque example of experimentation without adequate safeguards, a small, vertical monument to the desperation of a military in retreat.
By early 1945, Germany's skies were not the hunting ground of innovation, but a funerary isle for projects trying to recapture strategic initiative through technical shock. The Komets and Natters were not the instruments of salvation, they were symptoms. The Allies had seized the skies through a combination of industrial scale, operational learning, and relentless attrition. Germany's reply, ingenious and audacious, could not reverse that tide in the time it had left. In the end, the human portrait of these programs is the most important record. Engineers like Lippisch and Bacon were brilliant, humane, and patriotic in complex combinations. They designed machines that solved some problems with absolute clarity, but their designs were wrenched into service by a war machine that had lost the ability to support them safely. Pilots stepped into cockpits with courage and a grim understanding of risk. Ground crews worked under the pall of air raids, handling materials that could eat through steel and skin. Commanders, pressured from above and above them, sought solutions that sometimes bordered on the desperate. What remains now, long after the roar faded, is a lesson in limits. Technology alone is not enough. Without stable logistics, reliable supply, thoughtful doctrine, and the patience to test and train, the most elegant designs can become lethal traps. The Komet interceptors of the late war were marvels and mistakes at once. Brilliant answers to impossible questions, instruments that burned so fast they consumed their makers. If we listen closely to the gravelly voices in post-war interviews, to the brittle notes in test logs, to the burnt hulls found in scrapyards, we hear a single clear refrain. Speed and power without safety is a bargain struck in blood. The Komet climbed like an omen. The Natter rose like a promise and crashed into a warning. Both teach the same final truth. The cost of innovation in war is paid first and always in human lives. This is not only a military history. It is a human story of pride, of ambition, of fear, and of the thin line between genius and ruin. The Me-163 and the BA-349 stand forever as monuments to what happens when desperate times meet brilliant minds,
when speed becomes a virtue and nothing else is left to be traded.